Well, welcome to Module 3. Before we get going, I just want to say and make comments on how much I've appreciated your work thus far. Like Module 2, Module 3 is a 2-week block of time and assignments. So if you had issues trying to keep track of things happening over 2 weeks, make sure that you have things written down and scheduled for this next 2-week module. This module is devoted to research methods. Specifically, we'll examine the differences and relative advantages and limitations of collecting qualitative and quantitative data. You'll also review and learn about some basic research designs and data collection strategies. If you don't really know what I'm talking about right now, that's okay. We're moving forward and trying to get you interested and familiar with some of these different terms and research approaches. In this Module 3, you'll discover that we begin to fill in some of the questions that came up for you in the last module when you were thrown into the pool to begin reading and evaluating research. Trust me, I know how hard it is to read research, to synthesize it, without having done it before, without having been taught how to take these different things apart. I'm really happy to say that I don't believe we lost anyone, and don't worry if you feel like you were still trying to tread water. This stuff that we're doing is really hard. It's very difficult, and I want you to know that you are not the only person struggling. The struggle is the most important part of this, but we need to make sure that you're struggling at an appropriate level so that while you might not be certain how to do things yet, we need to make sure that as you're working on this and as you're reading research, that you feel some level of familiarity with what you're doing. And developing that familiarity is a slow process. This course is just one part of that instrumental thing. I still read studies and say duh, and have to read them again. In fact, I read studies multiple times, and I read them in different ways every time that I see them. Think again about the studies you read in the last module. Some researchers collected data by interviewing participants. Some videotaped their behavior, others recorded what they observed using some kind of tool, and some developed questionnaires or other surveys. There are lots of ways to design and study and collect data. What's important is that it's done systematically, that it's verifiable and ideally replicable by others. These two words, verifiable and replicable, are huge in research. While you may not yet be familiar with them or have a strong understanding of what they entail, you'll see as we progress through the term, these terms come up over and over again. Researchers call these approaches the research design of the study. Again, the research design is entailed by these approaches. These research designs vary by field and the type of question you're asking. Quantitative designs usually are deductive. The researcher is testing a hypothesis or hypotheses and has begun with a theory or theories that explain the phenomenon being studied. So that phenomenon could be learning, engagement, knowledge, teaching practices, whatever it might be. This means that for quantitative design to be an appropriate choice, the researcher has to have a sense of the relevant variables so that they can identify and describe them and understand their relationships to one another so they can be measured. This is a really important step. For quantitative to work, you have to have a way to measure things. And not just a haphazard way of measuring things, but a systematic way of measuring things, which includes having quantified and described variables in sufficient depth so that they can be measured and also related to each other. Quantitative studies often use formal instruments, like questionnaires or surveys, and include experimental design in which they manipulate and control variables. So, to test hypotheses and how these variables are related to each other. Again, to choose this approach, you have to understand the phenomenon well. This is not an exploratory piece. The goal of this approach is to determine causality, or very often is to determine causality. This happened because of this, and to collect data that can be generalized to other settings. In a lot of settings, including the education arena, these designs are privileged and seen as more scientific and rigorous, though there's plenty of room for thinking about how qualitative approaches are scientific and rigorous as well. Qualitative researchers are concerned primarily with process and understanding how people make sense of their lives, the experiences and structures of the world. Qualitative research always involves some sort of field work. Whether this is actually going out into the field, interviewing students, whatever it might be, it involves field work. The researcher physically goes to the people, setting, site, or institution to observe or record behavior in some sort of setting. Qualitative research tends to be descriptive in nature. It's interested in process, meaning, understanding gained through collecting words, pictures, or film. It's much richer in some sense. Richer is a hard word to use in terms of research, which is supposed to be systematic, but you tend to see more depth in the data. It's different from quantitative designs because it's inductive in that the researcher is building concepts and theories from data collected. So, it is very much hypothesis generating rather than hypothesis testing, which is much more associated with quantitative work. And it's best used in situations that have not been studied well or in depth. Very often, this is what action research looks like. The challenge for you, and the challenge for us, is to define an answerable question, and then based on the type of question, decide whether a quantitative or qualitative approach or some mix is reasonable. Lots of researchers combine these approaches. That takes a lot of work and a lot of experience in research. For the purposes of practitioner research relevant to teacher education, qualitative research is very likely going to be more relevant and useful. These are just a few thoughts to get you warmed up as we move forward in Module 3. Don't hesitate to check in with Allison and I as we go forward.